Take my medication. Good evening, everyone. I'm Liz Joyner, founder and president of the Village Square. And on behalf of the Village Square and Florida Humanities, we're delighted to welcome you this evening to The Pursuit of Liberty with our special guest, Jeffrey Rosen. This program is made possible by funding from Florida Humanities. It's part of a multi-year series of digital programs, UNUM, Democracy Reignited, exploring the past, present, and future of the American idea as it exists on paper, in the hearts of our people, and as it manifests in our lives. UNUM is funded in part by the Federation of State Humanities Councils with support from Mellon Foundation and Florida Humanities. It's also part of By the People Conversations Beyond 250, a series of community-driven programs created by Humanities Councils in collaboration with local partners. This initiative was developed by the Federation of State Humanities Councils, then the Smithsonian Center for Folklife and Cultural Heritage. Any views, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this program do not necessarily represent those of Florida Humanities or its partnering organizations. If you're not familiar with the work of Florida Humanities, we're putting their web addresses in the chat. Be sure to check them out. The chat window will be closed tonight, but you can ask questions at any time during the program by clicking on the Q&A link at the bottom of your screen. If you haven't taken our pre-event survey yet, if you'll take just a moment to do so now, we're dropping the link into the chat thread too. Your honest and anonymous answers will help the Village Square with a major nationally scoped research effort to better understand divisions in the United States. Even if you've done the survey for another program, we ask you to complete it again this time. We are delighted to welcome streaming partners Bridge USA, Braver Angels, USC Center for the Political Future, Living Room Conversations, National Institute for Civil Discourse, Listen First Project, Civic Health Project, McCourtney Institute for Democracy, Unify, Talking Politics and Religion Without Killing Each Other podcast, Citizen Connect, Center for the Humanities at University of Miami, Network for Responsible Public Policy, and our wonderful long-term local partners, the Tallahassee Democrat and WFSU Public Media. Now I get to introduce a dear friend of the Village Square and one of my all-time favorite humans, our former board chair, Steve Seibert. Steve is the current chair of the Pinellas Community Foundation. He's the former executive director of Florida Humanities, served under Governor Jeb Bush as the secretary of Florida's Department of Community Affairs, and served 2 terms on the Pinellas County Commission, a Florida Supreme Court certified mediator for over 30 years. Steve gained a statewide reputation for helping resolve contentious public and private sector disputes and has been named one of Florida's legal elite by Florida Trend magazine. In his long career, Steve has received appointments from 4 different Florida governors and from the Chief Justice of the Florida Supreme Court. Steve, welcome.
Thank you, Liz. Thank you for that generous introduction.
Well, I'm going to admit now that this is all just an elaborate ruse so that you and I could work together.
I love that. I love that. And get to meet Jeffrey Rosen all of this.
That's right. I didn't approve of your retirement, so we're just not going to let you. Anyway, enjoy. Thanks again for joining us, Steve.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you to Village Square and to Florida Humanities for hosting this extraordinary event. And thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for taking time out of your busy schedules to join us. I guarantee it will be worth it. Tonight, we hear from one of America's preeminent big thinkers, Professor Jeffrey Rosen. Jeff understands and can explain the great sweeps of history and how they influence our own time. He is, as they say in the Northeast, wicked smart, and he's a really nice man. Now, I will say that his more formal resume is nothing short of inspirational. Jeffrey Rosen served for 12 years as the CEO of the National Constitution Center and is now the CEO Emeritus of that organization. He is currently a professor of law at the George Washington University Law School. He is a contributing editor of The Atlantic magazine. He He was previously the legal affairs editor of the New Republic and a staff writer for the New Yorker. Rosen is the author of a number of books, which include the New York Times bestsellers Conversations with RBG, and one of my favorite books, The Pursuit of Happiness: How Classical Writers on Virtue Inspired the Lives of the Founders and Defined America. His new book, which will be our focus tonight, is entitled The Pursuit of Liberty: How Hamilton versus Jefferson Ignited the Lasting Battle Over Power in America. Jeff is a graduate of Harvard College, a graduate of Oxford University, where he was a Marshall Scholar, and a graduate of the Yale Law School. He is an elected member of the American Philosophical Society, which, by the way, was founded by Benjamin Franklin in 1743, and the American Law Institute. Ladies and gentlemen, we are so incredibly fortunate tonight to welcome Jeff Rosen.
So great to be with you, Steve. Thank you for those wonderful words, and can't wait for our conversation.
Well, that is extremely exciting. Okay, let's start with the basics here on this amazing book, The Pursuit of Liberty. I think what you say is that virtually all American political and legal history is a continuation of the debate between Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton. Yes?
Yes. End of conversation. It was great to talk to you.
There we go. So talk to us about that. Let's really delve into the details of what that debate was and how it's morphed over the years.
Well, it's really a number of debates, in particular the debates between national power and states' rights, between executive power and judicial power, between democracy versus rule by elites, and between liberal versus strict construction of the Constitution. And just to concretize them, which of those should we start with, just to kind of help our friends in the audience understand how central these debates have been ever since Hamilton and Jefferson's time?
Let's start with federal versus state power.
So this is arguably the central debate in all of American constitutional history, and it goes back to the Declaration of Independence, which declared that we were one people who were asserting our rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But the question of which people that was it the people of the states or the people of the nation? And in the Constitutional Convention, there was a big debate whether we the people meant we the people of the whole United States or we the people of the individual states. And then the battle came to a head during the first Congress over Hamilton and Jefferson, and in particular their debate over the Bank of the United States. Might we talk about that?
Yes, please, let's.
So as soon as the Constitution is up and running, Hamilton is Secretary of the Treasury, and he wants to create a national bank. And George Washington isn't sure whether or not it's consistent with the Constitution. So he asks Hamilton and Jefferson to write memos to him on the topic. And Jefferson, the Secretary of State, finds that the bank is not constitutional because he wants to strictly construe federal power, in particular, the necessary and proper clause, which says that Congress can make laws necessary and proper for carrying out the foregoing powers, the enumerated powers. Jefferson wants to construe the word necessary strictly to mean absolutely, indispensably, indubitably necessary. And since it's not absolutely necessary to charter a bank to achieve the enumerated powers of raising taxes or of promoting the general welfare, Jefferson says it's unconstitutional. Hamilton disagrees. He stays up all night. He writes 14,000 words. He's got incredible productivity. He wants to construe the word necessary liberally to mean useful or conducive or appropriate. And because it might be useful or conducive or appropriate to charter a bank to raise taxes and promote the general welfare, he says it's constitutional. Washington sides with Hamilton over Jefferson, and that central decision to side with the nation and the Union over the states sets up all the battles that follow for the rest of American history.
Wow. Um, so, so then we that leads to discussions of state sovereignty. You know, can a state nullify a federal law? Can a state secede from the Union? Can a state continue the practice of slavery, or keep slavery from happening? I mean, all right, aren't those all the questions that were being discussed during that period of time?
That's exactly right. And those questions of nullification and secession come to a head a little later in the administration in 1798 under Adams, when he passes the Alien and Sedition laws, which make it a crime to criticize the Federalist president, John Adams, but not a crime to criticize the Republican vice president, Thomas Jefferson. So Jefferson and Madison write protests. They're called the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. And Jefferson, in his Kentucky resolution, essentially takes the position that if a state thinks that a federal law is unconstitutional, it can nullify it. In other words, refuse to obey it. He takes the radical view that the states are sovereign and that the Union is just a compact between states. And anytime a state objects to a federal law, it can nullify. That's a little too much for Madison. He prefers that states can interpose their objection, which is a word so technical that only he can understand it. It's not clear exactly what he means, but he stops short of nullification and secession. And then it really comes to a head in the years leading up to the Civil War, when Jefferson, at the end of his life, seems to endorse the idea that a state could secede from the Union if it doesn't agree with federal policy. Once again, that's too much for Madison, who disagrees. He sees a kind of dual sovereignty. And the great Abraham Lincoln sides with Hamilton and Washington over Jefferson and says that secession is unconstitutional because we, the people of the entire United States, made the Union. You need the consent of the whole people in order to change it. And in the end, the war came, Lincoln famously said, and then once the Confederacy is defeated, that stood for the proposition that Lincoln and Hamilton were right and that Jefferson was wrong.
Yeah. So let's stay in the kind of the revolutionary time and right after that for a minute. So where is John Marshall and the Supreme Court during all of this time? How are they weighing in?
Marshall views himself as Hamilton's successor. He thinks Hamilton is the greatest American next to George Washington. After Hamilton dies, he views himself as a kind of Federalist redoubt, using the courts to resist the excesses of democracy that are championed by Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans. And he also cordially detests Jefferson, who's a distant relative, and they have a rivalry, and they have all sorts of wonderful insults for each other. Marshall calls Jefferson the great Lama of the mountain. Not what it means, but he's sort of sitting up at Monticello looking down on the world. And Jefferson replies that Marshall is guilty of twistifications, by which he means if Marshall asks him the time of day, he'll say, "I don't know, sir, I can't tell," because Marshall will always twist his words against him. It's Marshall who famously rules that the Supreme Court has the power to strike down unconstitutional laws in a dispute with Jefferson in Marbury versus Madison about whether or not Madison, as Secretary of State, has to deliver a commission that John Adams made at the last minute. But it really comes to a head in the case over the bank, and this is called McCulloch versus Maryland. And Marshall is deciding it, and he has beside him Hamilton and Jefferson's memos to Washington, because he's writing Washington's biography. Bushrod Washington has given him Washington's papers. And he reads Hamilton's memo, and he paraphrases it almost word for word. It's remarkable how closely he tracks Hamilton's language. In a famous sentence, he says something like, "Let the end be legitimate," and all means appropriate to carrying it into effect or consistent with the Constitution, more or less. A direct paraphrase of Hamilton. And that comes to be the definitive statement of what's called liberal construction of the Constitution for the rest of American history. Marshall rejects Jeffersonian strict construction. And uh, and he goes on throughout his great chief justiceship to champion Union and Hamilton over states' rights and Jefferson.
So the obvious conclusion to draw with this was not a given. The Supreme Court's authority to strike down a state law, for example, as being inconsistent with the Constitution, the supremacy of the Supreme Court was not a given, even after the Constitution had been written.
It wasn't. Most of the delegates to the convention seemed to assume some power of judicial review, the power to strike down unconstitutional laws, and including Jefferson, who championed a Bill of Rights because he thought that it would be enforced by judges against illiberal majorities. But it took Marshall in Marbury versus Madison to assert it, although he'd asserted it in an earlier case. The basic justification for judicial review comes from Hamilton. It's in Federalist 78. And Hamilton says the Constitution represents the will of the people and is supreme law, whereas an ordinary statute represents the will of legislators and is less than supreme. And if there's a conflict between the will of the people versus the will of the legislators, you choose, Hamilton says, the master over the servant, the principal over the agent. So that's the basic idea, that because the Constitution was ratified by the people in special conventions, it represents a more deep, considered, and fundamental expression of the people's will than a law that Congress passes today. And that's the view that Marshall embraced, and that established the principle of judicial review.
Talk to us a little bit about the role of you mentioned earlier, the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, and sort of where these two illustrious leaders kind of fell in what they valued the most. We'll talk about Lincoln later and his adoration of the Declaration, but how did these guys view those two documents?
Well, in some sense, John Quincy Adams said that Jefferson was the father of the Declaration, obviously, because he wrote it, and Hamilton almost the father of the Constitution in his championing of the national vision. Both Hamilton and Jefferson, of course, subscribed to the principles of the Declaration, although they disagreed about who the one people were. Was it the people of the states or the people of the nation? Jefferson, they had disagreements about the Constitution, in particular about the scope of executive power, which we can talk about in a moment. Well, maybe is this a good
Sure.
time to talk about their disagreements about the Constitution?
Absolutely.
About executive power. Well, here, I begin the book with a great story about executive power. Great, just because it so vividly encapsulates their different views. It takes place in the room where it happened, Jefferson's house on Maiden Lane in New York, but not the dinner celebrated in the musical where they agree to move the capital from New York to DC in exchange for assuming the national debt. This is a year later. It's at Jefferson's house. Washington's away. At some point in the evening, Jefferson is presiding over the table. Hamilton looks around the room and says, "Who are those three guys on the wall?" And Jefferson says, "Those are my three visions of the greatest men in history, John Locke, Francis Bacon, and Isaac Newton." And Hamilton pauses for a long time and then blurts out, "The greatest man that ever lived was Julius Caesar." And Jefferson writes, "This proved that Hamilton was not only for a monarchy, but a monarchy bottomed on corruption." And he goes on to found the Democratic Republican Party in supposed opposition to the Caesarism and monarchism of the monocrats, as he calls them, represented by Hamilton. It's a striking story because Hamilton too fears the tyranny of a Caesar. He thinks he'll come from below rather than above, flattering the people and persuading them to abandon their liberty in exchange for cheap luxury. His solution to the danger of a tyrannical demagogue is a life term for the president, because he thinks if the president is elected for life, he won't be tempted to engage in the cheap arts of popularity and to corrupt the people with flattery and bribes. Jefferson has the opposite view. When he gets a copy of the Constitution, he says to Madison he has two objections. One, there's no Bill of Rights. And two, the president is eligible for reelection. And a future president, because he's eligible for reelection, might, in Jefferson's words, uh, lose an election by a few votes, cry foul, refuse to leave office, and enlist the states who voted for him to support him. Jefferson's solution is a one-year term limit for the president. Of course, neither is adopted, and Washington establishes the tradition of stepping down after two terms, which Jefferson keeps and which holds until Franklin Roosevelt breaks it. Franklin Roosevelt himself, often assailed as a Julius Caesar, he makes fun of these claims by dressing up like Julius Caesar for his birthday party in 1932 with Eleanor dressed as a Roman matron. But after his fourth term, he dies and Congress proposes and the states adopt the 22nd Amendment, which says you can only be twice elected to the office of president. But that just shows how their very different visions of executive power are part of this essential clash that they have between democracy and rule by elites. And Jefferson believes the will of the majority should always prevail and wants to have a weak executive who will submit to Congress. And Hamilton, thinking that elites must rule, wants a strong president immune to popular flattery. And that is a basic division that's persisted throughout American history.
That leads us to, or it leads me anyway, to thinking about human nature and I think there's another debate there, isn't there, on what both Hamilton or what Hamilton and Jefferson really believed about the people and how perfectible the people might be. And in your earlier book, in the Pursuit of Happiness, you talk about the influences of a number of philosophers on the founding fathers, and David Hume's name keeps coming up. And if you wouldn't mind, kind of talk us through a little bit about the different views of human nature of these two gentlemen and maybe what role Hume played in this discussion.
They do have very different views of human nature, and Hume is central. In a sense, Hamilton takes a dark view of human nature, believes that people are fallen and need to have their passions restrained by a strong government. And Jefferson takes a rosy view of human nature and thinks that people are essentially good and can be perfected through education. Hamilton is a great follower of Hume, who scoffed at the idea that reason could always tame passion, which was the Enlightenment view channeled from the Stoics. And instead, he said reason is and always must be the slave of passion, by which he meant that our decisions about the truth are a complicated blend of emotion and tradition and manners. And we need states to be constructed around a realistic view of human nature, founded in the separation of powers, to ensure that people's darker passions don't get the better of them. In a sense, it's the oldest difference in the world between liberals and conservatives, between Federalists and Anti-Federalists, between Whigs and Tories. Jefferson views Hume and the Tory view of history as far too favorable to the executive and prefers Lord Coke and parliamentary sovereignty and then congressional sovereignty. And that disagreement defines their politics.
So in Hamilton's view, because people are flawed, because they're self-interested, right? There needs to be a stronger government to, I'm not saying this, I don't think I'm saying it correctly, but this is, I think, really, really important. There needs to be a structure there to curtail the excesses of both the people and of any potential despot that may be out there that could appeal to those people. That would be Hamilton's view.
That's exactly right.
Okay. And then Jefferson, on the other hand, is, I think you right, has a rosier view of human nature, that people, particularly if they're agrarian and are not, in the big cities, the yeoman farmer, um, a, a, a rosier view, and that all we really need, says the founder of the University of Virginia, is more education. And if there's that, then people will exercise their reason and will govern themselves capably.
Yes, it's not a democratic in any sense we would recognize it today. Jefferson establishes at UVA that only the boys of the best genius should be admitted from around the state. He does believe in a natural aristocracy that is not accessible to all white men, and certainly not, of course, to women or enslaved people because of his obvious his terrible hypocrisies on those questions. But he does have an essential faith in the democratizing potential of education, and Hamilton and John Adams view this as romantic claptrap. They think it's just far too rosy a view of human nature.
It's interesting to think about how we form our structure of government based on our view of human nature, and a conversation that was really active in the 17 and 1800s, but we don't talk about it at all today.
So true. But it is important to stress the consensus. Both Hamilton and Jefferson are devoted to the separation of powers. There's a consensus at the time of the Revolution that power corrupts, that you cannot entrust all power to a single king or parliament or people. This is a consequence of the Roman historian Polybius, who identifies three types of government in their pure and degenerate form. In Polybius's view, monarchy turns always to tyranny, aristocracy to oligarchy, and democracy to the mob. In order to prevent any pure form from degenerating into its opposite, you need mixed government where the king or the monarchical element is represented in the king or in the president, the aristocratic in the House of Lords or the Senate, and the popular in the House of Commons or the House of Representatives. And Jefferson and Hamilton, despite their different views of human nature, agree on the centrality of the separation of powers.
Interesting. So what else did they agree on?
Well, they agreed on the American idea. They agreed on the principles of the Declaration and the Constitution. That is, liberty, equality, and government by consent. Despite Jefferson's campaign rhetoric, Hamilton is devoted to Republican government. He opposes hereditary rule, and he supports the centrality of the protection of liberty. And he certainly supports the idea that all human beings are created equal. And similarly, they support the principles of the Constitution, namely separation of powers and a Bill of Rights and an independent judiciary. So it's extremely important to note that although they disagree about how to balance these different values of liberty versus equality, or national power versus states' rights, or democracy versus rule by elites, they agree on the principles of the Declaration and the Constitution.
Interesting. But with very different interpretations of those kind of precious words, right? So, as you said about all men are created equal, consent of the governed, freedom and liberty. They had different. Am I correct in saying they had different views of what those words meant?
They did, and that's why I say that their competing ideas are like golden and silver threads woven throughout the tapestry of American history. Sometimes they are side by side, sometimes they cross, sometimes they pull so far apart that they threaten to snap. But it's the productive tension between those threads that has sustained the American idea. And that's why their disagreement is not a bug in the system, but a feature.
So we shouldn't worry about the intellectual polarization of our day. I'm going to ask this. It's a form of a question. We shouldn't worry about it because it is a feature of our system. It is that give and take is the core of democracy. Would you argue that?
Well, we shouldn't worry about disagreement because disagreement is the core of democracy, and civil disagreement and disagreeing without being disagreeable is necessary. But you mentioned the polarization today, and there is a point at which disagreement turns to viewing the other side not as opponents but enemies, and that is something that the system cannot survive with, because once you're more determined to destroy the other side than to debate them, then the productive disagreement is no longer possible.
Tell the story, if you will, of the busts in Jefferson's foyer.
It's so striking that when Hamilton dies in the duel, Jefferson places a bust of Hamilton across from his own in the entrance hall of Monticello. You can see it there today when you go there. And when he passed the bust and he was old, he would smile faintly and say, "Opposed in life as in death." And for Jefferson, Hamilton is not a hated adversary to be, or a hated enemy to be destroyed, but a respected opponent to be engaged with. And that's the spirit that we've got to get back to today.
That's a stunning vision, it seems to me. Can you imagine political leaders today who would put just even a picture of somebody that they were fighting with? It would be as if, Lincoln put Jefferson. Well, no, that would be the wrong one. Put Stephen Douglas. A picture of Stephen Douglas on his wall.
No, it really is amazing. It's an incredible sign of respect for the significance of Hamilton and of Jefferson's open-mindedness. He was so partisan as president, and he was a political street fighter, and he would use gossip against his opponents. But in the end, he was devoted to the American idea. It is significant that Hamilton sacrificed his life because he favored Jefferson over Burr in the election of 1800.
Great point.
That's because Hamilton viewed Jefferson, he didn't like his politics, but he thought he was a patriot, where he viewed Burr as a traitor. And he was right, because he thought Burr was conspiring to lead an insurrection in Spanish Louisiana and set himself up as a kind of emperor of Mexico and lead a secessionist movement. And subsequent evidence uncovered by the historian Henry Adams found letters from Burr to the British ambassador offering his services for this scheme. And there was testimony at Burr's treason trial that he had said, hang Jefferson, and praised Caesar and Catiline. So Hamilton was right to worry, and it was his siding with Jefferson that won Jefferson the election. And Burr got wind of Hamilton's speaking against him, and that's what led to the duel.
Yeah. So let's move forward a little bit and move into the 1850s and 1860s. Let's move to Lincoln, and maybe what was happening right before the outbreak of the Civil War. I mean, you just told us that when those rare occasions when disagreements become violent, I guess, when we no longer can debate and we end up, killing each other. That's when the threads have failed, when they've expanded, I guess, are no longer together. So what was happening there, and then how did Lincoln sort of deal with this disagreement?
Well, Lincoln's first great political speech, his address to the young men at Springfield, is an argument for the rule of law in the face of mob violence. And there are mobs that are destroying abolitionist
Yeah.
presses and murdering opponents of slavery. And Lincoln, who uses the word mob repeatedly in the speech, says that unless we embrace the rule of law as a kind of civil religion and lisp it to our children before they sleep and embrace it to our hearts, then the Union will fall. And then, of course, he becomes a founder of the new Republican Party in 1857, and he denounces the Dred Scott decision, which strikes down the Missouri Compromise, interestingly, on grounds that it is not authorized by the Territories Clause of the Constitution, which Chief Justice Taney wants to construe strictly to mean only those territories that had been held by the Union when the Constitution was drafted. There's a kind of dizzying series of flip-flops by Jefferson himself on this question. He had originally supported Congress's power to ban slavery in the territories in the Northwest Ordinance of 1784. Then he becomes president, and he wants to strictly construe the Constitution to deny the bank. But then he wants to buy Louisiana and double the size. So even though he thinks it's unconstitutional under the Territories Clause, he briefly thinks about, well, maybe we need a constitutional amendment, and then says, never mind, and buys it anyway because he's more interested in the pragmatic benefit than in the constitutional scruples. But then switches one last time, and when it comes time, when Congress in the Missouri Compromise bans slavery north of the 38th parallel, Jefferson says that that is unconstitutional, and Chief Justice Taney embraces the argument of the later Jefferson in striking down the Missouri Compromise. And a concurring justice in the case says, well, in that case, Jefferson himself was a hypocrite when he bought Louisiana. He can't have been right twice. It shows how these positions can be embraced opportunistically. Lincoln closely follows these debates. He views the Dred Scott decision as wrong. But at the same time, he embraces the principles of the Declaration of Independence. And he stands in front of Independence Hall in 1861 and says, I've never had a thought politically that didn't stem from the Declaration. I'd rather be assassinated on this spot than abandon its principles. And he says, all honor to Jefferson. It's an interesting choice by Lincoln because, of course, in many ways, he's a nationalist. He's Hamiltonian in his view of national power. He embraces the American system, which was Hamilton's words for a kind of strong federal government that would create internal improvements and roads. And yet, because Hamilton's name is politically toxic, he repeatedly quotes Jefferson and insists that it's the principles of the Declaration that in the end have to be invoked to end slavery itself. So
Yeah.
is negotiating that tension with remarkable and thoughtful finesse. And in the end, he creates a new birth of freedom, as he puts it, thoughtfully quoting that language about of, by, and for the people, amazingly traces all the way back to nationalists, starting with John Marshall in a great Supreme Court opinion. Then it's picked up by Daniel Webster, the nationalist who admires Hamilton and Marshall, and then Lincoln basically puts it into the Gettysburg Address. So it just shows how that Hamiltonian thread of nationalism is embraced by Lincoln, even as he's embracing Jefferson as his patron saint.
Isn't that something? So it's not binary. It's not a simple. We're not. This concept of Jefferson and Hamilton are not simple concepts that you can just spout and say, well, I believe in Hamilton's approach. It's more nuanced than that, and certainly more nuanced in Lincoln's view of how to lead and how to run a nation in a civil war.
There are no pure Hamiltonians or Jeffersonians in American history. People switch between them, often opportunistically, but also because of the malleability of their views. You can find something in Hamilton or Jefferson to suit any situation, and that's why I was inspired to write the book reading a historian from the Progressive era, Herbert Crowley, who called on Theodore Roosevelt to embrace Hamiltonian means for Jeffersonian ends, namely the Hamiltonian means of strong federal power for the Jeffersonian ends of curbing the corporations and promoting democracy.
Mm.
Theodore Roosevelt picked up that challenge and said, I am a Hamiltonian with respect to federal power and a Jeffersonian with regard to democracy. And ever since, presidents have really mixed the views of Hamilton and Jefferson with interesting finesse.
So, so you spend some time in the book on James Garfield in a really positive way, a thoughtful, avid reader, a pretty serious historian. And you also talk about the ebb and flow of the thinking in America, either where Jefferson may be in the ascension, or he, or Hamilton's in the accession. So maybe talk about what happens after the Civil War a little bit. Maybe in Garfield's eyes, I think Hamilton suddenly is rising now. He's not been well thought of for a long time, and suddenly he comes back again. Is that what happened? And then what happened after that?
That's exactly right. Hamilton dies in the duel. His name is mud. Everyone is a Jeffersonian, even the founder of the Whig Party, Henry Clay, embraces Jefferson along with Lincoln. And then the war came. And suddenly Jefferson becomes the prophet of secession and nullification. So President Grant banishes a statue of Jefferson, which had been moved from the Capitol to the White House by President Polk. It sends it back to the Capitol in disgrace. And a statue of Hamilton is installed in place of honor for the first time.
Interesting.
And a young James Garfield, before the Civil War, had read the collected works of Hamilton, which had just been published by Hamilton's son. And he said that the fate of Hamilton is waxing and Jefferson is falling. And he decides to make Hamilton a patron saint of Reconstruction. And during Reconstruction, Garfield invokes Hamilton for his economic policy, and in particular for the power to print paper money, which was necessary to fund the Civil War, in which the Supreme Court ultimately embraces. And James John Bingham, who is the author of the 14th Amendment, worships John Marshall and Hamilton and invokes him as justification for the post-Civil War amendments. And everyone is a Hamiltonian during the Reconstruction until a backlash against Reconstruction when the Supreme Court ruthlessly strikes down all of the pillars of Reconstruction, including the Civil Rights Act of 1875, under a Jeffersonian view of the necessary and proper clause. They're a Hamiltonian on all questions involving economics, but they become the most relentless, strict constructionists when it comes to matters of race, because they're just not in favor of continuing Reconstruction. And Hamilton continues, however, to be honored as the father of American capitalism, and he's taken up in the election of 1912 by all three candidates. I talked about Theodore Roosevelt embracing Hamiltonian means for Jeffersonian ends. Woodrow Wilson, surprisingly for a Southern Democrat, favors Hamilton because he questions the separation of powers and exalts Hamilton as the father of kind of parliamentary government and a strong executive. And William Howard Taft, the old traditional follower of John Marshall, is fighting the election to preserve judicial independence and exalts Hamilton as the greatest American next to Marshall. So everyone's a Hamiltonian, and the statue of him is put up in front of the Treasury where it stands today. And then suddenly, boom, the stock market crash of 1929 comes, and suddenly Jefferson's star rises again.
It's amazing. I just got a note from Liz that said, please remind people they can ask their questions anytime by clicking on the question and answer thing at the bottom of the screen. So I've now done my job, and let's go back to this historical story. So stock market crashes and we have FDR as our president. And suddenly Hamilton is not talked about. Does this is it taken away and Jefferson comes back in, or how does that work?
Well, the FDR story is amazing. So, in the 1920s, FDR reads a book called Jefferson versus Hamilton, The Struggle for Democracy Over Aristocracy. And he writes the only book review he's ever written and says it's time for a new Jefferson. And he invites the author, Claude Bowers, to speak to the Democratic Convention. He gets a standing ovation. And once FDR wins in 1932, he decides to make Jefferson the patron saint of the New Deal. Now, this can only be described as an act of what my people would call chutzpah, because FDR is just exploding the size of the federal government in ways that would have made the strict constructionist Jefferson cringe. But he decided to reinvent Jefferson as the prophet of democracy rather than limited government. And he puts Jefferson on the nickel, and he builds the Jefferson Memorial, and he dies right before Jefferson's birthday with an undelivered speech about Jefferson as the prophet of the post-war era. And he succeeds in totally rebranding Jefferson as a progressive Democrat rather than a conservative libertarian. And he's so successful that Ronald Reagan says that he left the Democratic Party in 1960 because it had abandoned the principles of the limited government Jefferson. And he astutely noted that in 1932, FDR had run as a balance the budget guy, accusing Herbert Hoover of busting the budget, and pledged to be a kind of, fiscally scrupulous. But then he created the New Deal and reinvented Jefferson. So FDR reclaims the libertarian rather than the progressive Jefferson, and that is the hero of the Republican Party in the 1980s.
That is amazing. So, okay, so you brought us, we're getting pretty close to where we are right now. Obviously, Hamilton itself, the play has, brought him up. But so where are we now? Where are Hamilton and Jefferson in the broad conversation in modern American politics?
Well, it is true that Hamilton the play totally rescued Hamilton. I had the honor of giving Ron Chernow the Liberty Medal, and he said that he decided to write the book because in 1991 or so, Hamilton was forgotten. No one was paying attention to him. And he was inspired by a sentence or rather, Lin-Manuel Miranda was inspired by a sentence in Chernow's biography after Hamilton writes an essay describing a hurricane on St. Croix that impressed local businessmen to send him to the United States to be educated to the colonies. Chernow wrote, Hamilton didn't know it, but he'd just written his way out of poverty. And that inspired Miranda to reinvent Hamilton as the multicultural rapping icon of the American dream. Talk about rebranding. Or talk about the old kind of Caesarist monarchist has been reinvented as the scrappy immigrant with a dream and a dollar. So it was just an amazing example of the ability of pop culture to transform a reputation. And that very much led a Hamiltonian revival in the 2000s. President Obama had debuted the musical at the White House for a poetry jam years before it opened on Broadway. And he quoted Hamilton in his Cooper Union speech and invoked him as a patron saint of healthcare reform. And Hamilton was having a revival in the 90s and 2000s, separate from the musical, of national greatness conservatives who wanted to champion national power, international intervention, and fiscal responsibility. At the same time that William Jefferson Clinton was so enamored of his namesake that he jogged around the Jefferson Memorial and rode from Monticello to DC for his inauguration and embraced Jefferson as the prophet of democracy. So there were both Hamilton and Jefferson had constituents in all of our recent presidents leading up to President Trump. And I see one of our questioners asks, would Trump be more of a follower of Hamilton than Jefferson? Shall I try?
Go ahead.
Very important question.
Yeah.
So I end the book by asking a slightly different question. Is President Trump Julius Caesar or Andrew Jackson? And his critics say that he's Caesar, the fulfillment of the founders' fears of a president who would consolidate all power in his own hands, subvert the separation of powers, and with the aid of a complacent Congress and a deferential Supreme Court, engage in the very tyrannical action that the founders feared. The counter argument is that he's Andrew Jackson. He's a populist who, like Jackson, resolved to shrink the size of the federal government. Jackson killed the bank. He fired John Quincy Adams' civil service appointees and instituted the spoils system. And he attacked elites. And President Trump stood in front of the Hermitage, Jackson's home, during his first term and celebrated his anniversary and said, I know the feeling, Andrew, because he was attacked by elites too. So he embraces Jackson as a model, and his supporters see him as such. He also, at Charlottesville, said that he was trying to prevent the Democrats from taking down statues of Jefferson, and stood in front of Mount Rushmore and said, we've got to preserve history and not be woke in that regard. But if forced to choose between Hamilton and Jefferson, it's I'm not sure that he's thought about the question. He has embraced McKinley, who was a nationalist and a Hamiltonian, but I think it's fair to say he hasn't deeply reflected on the conflict, and yet, in terms of his governing, I think we have to say that he's Hamilton on steroids. I mean, it's just from the it's the strongest assertions of executive power that we've seen since at least Roosevelt, if not less, both in the assertions of the war power and the use of executive orders and the deployment of troops.
The Insurrection Act, right? The 1792 and I guess 1807, right?
I mean, it's very hard to say. It's hard to see much Jefferson in President Trump at all, except in the populism. Jefferson was not a populist. He agreed in majority rule, but he criticized Jackson actually for courting too much the arts of popularity. So and not to say that President Trump's critics say he's going far beyond what Hamilton would have approved in his deployment of executive orders and his attacks on courts and so forth. But if forced to choose, he certainly seems more Hamiltonian than Jeffersonian.
So before we get to other questions from the audience, which I'm delighted to see. So here was the question I was really struggling with as I was thinking about tonight. Somewhere in the book, I think you say this, please confirm this one way or another. I think you say that neither Hamilton nor Jefferson would be considered originalists in the way that we term it today. Did you say that? Did you write that?
I did. Hamilton, we know, he called himself for a liberal construction of the Constitution, right, and thought that it should be construed according to its spirit in order to achieve its broad purposes of creating union and economic prosperity and security, and was certainly not a strict constructionist and wasn't interested in the views of the convention, especially. He never cited the founders' own views as binding in constitutional interpretation, even though he wrote the Federalist Papers himself. Jefferson is more complicated. He does say that we should carry ourselves, in answering a constitutional question, carry ourselves back to the spirit in which it was passed and consult the views of those who voted for it rather than against it. In other words, not to distort it in a way that it wasn't intended. However, Jefferson also thought that in the event of a disagreement between the courts and the people today, there should either be a constitutional convention or some kind of referendum, because he didn't think that the court should be able to impose a strict constructionist view against the wills of current majorities, and by the end of his life was very much opposed to federal review at all, and seemed to suggest that the states could reach a different conclusion than the Supreme Court in interpreting the Constitution. So to the degree that the current court favors both judicial supremacism, believing that the Supreme Court should have the last word, and originalism, that's not a view Jefferson would have embraced. There's also a tension between textualism and originalism. Jefferson is more devoted to strictly construing the words than to looking at original meaning. And that's a debate that persists on the Supreme Court today, where judges who call themselves originalists may view themselves as textualists in some circumstances or view history in others. And Jefferson, too, switched often between text and history in order to achieve particular results. So this is all to say, it's not, although none of the justices, none of the founders, neither Hamilton nor Jefferson nor Madison actually, could be considered originalists in the sense that it's used today, in insisting that the original public meaning of the text should rule. The debates that we're having today about the relationship between text and original meaning and liberal and strict construction do go back to Hamilton and Jefferson.
Well, and so let me close with this portion with this question. So we have two illustrious members of the founding clan, in Jefferson and Hamilton, who have, as we talked earlier, have really very divergent views of most of the political questions of the day and of the interpretation, certainly of the Constitution, and in some degree of the Declaration. How can we find, we being modern Americans, how can we find direction? How can we find solace? How can we find union in this conversation? Where is the safe ground that we can all grab onto so that we can regain a vision for America?
A commitment to the rule of law. It's a healthy and encouraging sign when the Supreme Court struck down the tariffs the other day that the justices are debating, a version of strict versus liberal construction, and are respectfully engaging questions like the major questions doctrine, which says that you need a clear statement from Congress in order to make important policy decisions. And Justice Gorsuch's separate concurrence, which disagrees with his colleagues, does so respectfully, about these very debates that Hamilton and Jefferson themselves engaged in. And just in the oral argument today before the Supreme Court, the justices were debating what John Adams and Madison would have thought qualified as drunkenness. Justice Gorsuch said, Madison drank whiskey every day and Adams a tankard of cider, and therefore you shouldn't be able to ban guns from people who use medical marijuana. But I guess what I'm saying is that we must be committed to the debate on the courts, and to taking history seriously, and that although there are very legitimate and important disagreements about how much history should bind, it's a common vocabulary that allows us to have respectful debates and ensures the rule of law.
Thank you. That's very, very clear. I'm looking up now at some of the questions that people have asked, and let's move to those. So the first one talks about perhaps the hypocrisy of current politicians that, believe in principles only so far as those principles benefit their side, and then they abandon them. Has this always been the case? Is this a fairly new problem if it is, or were the framers similarly that hypocritical?
They were. It's a founding hypocrisy. I mean, it goes back to Jefferson and the Louisiana Purchase. I mean, talk about chutzpah, just amazing. And that's because principle constrains politics. Without principle, politics can descend into violence, but politics can't be guided entirely by principle. And people have always shifted back and forth and adjusted their principles to meet current exigencies. So sometimes it's a healthy evolution of views. I think Madison is the kind of model here. He changes his mind about the constitutionality of the bank, initially opposing it, but then coming to think that because Congress and the people have come to accept it, then its meaning has been liquidated and it should be embraced. He has some humility. He's willing to defer to the considered constitutional views of the people rather than sticking to his own original view. And it's a remarkable fact that when Madison dies, he's sitting in Montpelier and his daughter comes in and he slightly shifts in his chair and she says, "Is anything wrong?" And he says, "Nothing, my dear, only a change of mind." And then he expires. So it's just a beautiful example of intellectual humility at its best. And there's an example of how, you can change your mind for principled rather than opportunistic reasons. But Madison himself also switched and became far more of a states' rights guy after the convention than he was before. And he, as president, embraces broad federal power that he previously criticized. It's impossible to be consistently principled.
Interesting. So, and that leads to a question we talked about prior to the program tonight. The role of compromise, of if we have diverse opinions, and if problems are that a nation faces are complex, if both of those things are true, then doesn't democracy demand compromise? Is that a principle?
Yes, it is a principle. It's a Madisonian principle. It's the central Madisonian principle that you have to settle for the imperfect and recognize that we're all fallible. And that the convention was one where Madison didn't get the central things he wanted. I mean, what he thought was most important was a national veto, the ability of Congress to veto state laws that it thought were unconstitutional or wrong, and also a amendment that would have prohibited the states as well as the federal government from violating the rights of conscience and trial by jury. It was far more James Wilson's Constitution than James Madison's, and yet he defended it, as did Hamilton, in the Federalist Papers with all his force, because he agreed with Ben Franklin that although the document wasn't perfect, it was as close to perfection as could be expected, and that was the nature of politics.
And in that process, then there is a public humility that's required. What is Franklin's phrase? You'll remember it. Doubt your infallibility.
Yes, exactly.
Right. Doubt. He would ask. Here is perhaps the greatest thinker in American history, who who urged his fellows to doubt their infallibility and put their names to this document, to the Constitution. That's a striking thought, and one that just seems so foreign in today's conversation.
It's impossible to doubt your infallibility when you're determined to destroy your opponents. And that's why Learned Hand said that the spirit of liberty is the spirit that's not too sure that it's right.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Okay, and questions from our colleagues. Let's see. In researching the founder's writings, was there a moment when your own understanding, particularly of happiness, shifted in a meaningful way?
Well, it just shifted entirely. This unusual COVID era reading project I had uh, transformed the way I thought about how to be a good person and a good citizen. And during COVID, I noticed that both Franklin and Jefferson had adopted as their mottos for happiness a book by Cicero I'd never heard of called the Tusculan Disputations. Uh, and Cicero had said, without virtue, happiness cannot be. So I decided to read Cicero, and then I found this incredible reading list that Jefferson would hand out to anyone who asked how to be educated. And there's a section on moral philosophy that sometimes Jefferson called ethics or natural religion. At the top of the list was Cicero's Tusculan Disputations, then Seneca, Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius, and Enlightenment moral philosophers like Locke and Hutcheson and Hume. I set out to read the books because I just was embarrassed that I'd never read them before, despite my great liberal arts education, which I'm so grateful for. And I just did this crazy thing during COVID. I still can't believe I did it, and I'm not doing it now. So I have to confess up. But I got up early every morning. I read moral philosophy for 2 hours. I watched the sunrise. I wrote sonnets, and then I wrote this book about what I learned about how, for the founders, happiness meant not feeling good, but being good, not the pursuit of immediate pleasure, but the pursuit of long-term virtue. And by virtue, they meant character improvement, self-improvement, lifelong learning, and using your powers of reason to moderate your unreasonable passions and emotions so you can achieve the calm tranquility and focus that allows you to be your best self and serve others. It was a remarkable experience. I do want to fess up. It's changed my morning habits, and it was that discipline of getting up early and reading that allowed me to write this Hamilton and Jefferson book, um, and just getting off my screens, which I'm addicted to, and taking some time in the morning for focused reading and writing. But I must, in the spirit of transparency, could say that I'm not doing it right now, and I miss it. I'm trying to find the self-discipline to get back to that um, habit of daily reading, because it is the most fulfilling path to the pursuit of happiness that I can imagine.
How very enlightenment, right? So you had the founders that in, I think you explained, not everyone, but most of them were doing that same kind of reading. They all talked about the same intellectual influences, right?
It's so inspiring, and that is the most inspiring thing about the founders. They're flawed. They are, in some ways, hypocritical. They don't practice all the virtues that they preach, but they're lifelong learners. And until the end of their life, they're keeping up that disciplined schedule of reading and writing. Jefferson and Adams in their letters until the end are
Yeah.
trading recommendations about comparative religion and moral philosophy and debating whether Pythagoras was influenced by the Bhagavad Gita. It's just so
Yeah.
moving and so deep. And they're such deep readers, and they never lose those habits. I fear that the screens are really the enemy of this deep reading. I was struck by what readers many of our presidents have been, all the way up to the present. I guess you could say that President Obama was the last deep daily reader, but President Bush, uh, Clinton, I won't go all the way back, but you know, I was really struck back to John Quincy Adams and Martin Van Buren, actually, what deep readers our presidents have been. And I fear that the temptations of screens are so irresistible that we face an existential crisis and that we're losing the habits of deep reading.
You have a pretty powerful personal story about that with your father and the motto that he felt so strongly about. Could you share that with us?
Yes, it's on the bookcase behind me. I don't know if you can see it through the camera, but the my grandfather, who I never met, my father's dad, was a Jewish immigrant from uh, Galicia, which was part of Poland, came to America, settled in Detroit, was a street peddler, and sold dry goods, like many Jewish immigrants of that era. And one day he was passing by the newly opened Detroit Public Library, which had opened in 1932, the Skillman branch, and he saw a motto above the pediment, which is still there today. And it says, "The fountain of wisdom flows through books." And he was so determined to pass these values on to my dad that he carved the letters by hand and glued them to a desk sign. And I guess I'll get up and show it because it's right here.
Oh my.
The fountain of wisdom flows through books.
Oh my.
The image of him, just a street peddler taking his tools and gluing these letters onto this sign because he valued learning so much, is makes this my most precious possession.
That's beautiful. Wow. And I guess the follow-up question would be, can a democracy survive if we stop reading?
I'm not sure we can. I don't know that we can survive. I don't know that we can survive as individuals without reading or without the aspiration to read and learn. That's the great democratizing principle of education, from privileged founders to people like Lincoln and Frederick Douglass, who
Yeah.
nothing, but just through the relentless quest of self-improvement and self-education, uh, willed themselves into greatness through lifelong learning. My instinct is that in this age of great distraction and dislocation, that the salvation, the spiritual salvation, not only of democracy but of us as individuals, is in reading. And we live in the most miraculous age in human history when all the books in the world are either free and online or essentially, available for at the click of a button. And all we need is the self-discipline to read them. Now, I acknowledge that it's hard to keep up that habit, but I deny that it is something only available to the privileged, because throughout history, it's been the main engine of economic mobility and self-improvement. And I'm on a crusade for the central value of deep reading.
Thank you for that. And thank you for showing us your grandfather's sign. One person has asked, there is a group of Orlando Stoics that's currently going through your book.
Awesome.
My question is, who do you view as more stoic, Jefferson or Hamilton?
Great question.
A great question.
Well, my goodness, it's got to be Hamilton. I mean, Jefferson was, he at the end of his life, he tells Adams that he used to like Cicero, but now he's an Epicurean,
Ah,
which he meant not a
yeah,
wanton pleasure seeker, but that's a libel on Epicurus by the Stoics, but someone who will rationally contract his desires so that he can pursue rational pleasure. So, but yet he lives at Monticello like
right.
Caligula, and surrounds himself with his own kids. Those are the enslaved people who are actually serving him in his house, and completely violates all of his principles of frugality and even of industry because of his reliance on enslaved labor.
Yeah.
Whereas Hamilton is just Stakhanovite in his work ethic, certainly. I mean, Jefferson, of course, was too, but he didn't rely on enslaved labor for it. And just until the end, he goes into political disgrace. He's got to support himself as a lawyer. He just never stops working. And so I say that Hamilton is the Stoic.
Got it. Here's a question from Kami at the USC Center for the Political Future, one of the streaming partners here. I like, what is your favorite amendment and why?
Well, at the Constitution Center, we say we're not allowed to have favorite amendments like
That's
favorite
true. That's
trophies.
true.
But you know, if I go with Madison. Madison thought the whole purpose of the Constitution was to protect freedom of conscience. And I agree, and freedom of conscience is in the First Amendment. So that's my favorite amendment.
Got it. You've noted, here's another question, that the American experiment relies on a good faith commitment to the struggle between Hamiltonian and Jeffersonian visions. Given that Eliza Hamilton spent 50 years after Alexander's death collecting his papers and successfully petitioning Congress to publish them, how much of our modern understanding of this battle over power do we owe specifically to her role as his primary historical gatekeeper?
Wonderful question. And let's give her full credit. It's all about primary texts. And it was because of her inspiration that their son first published his collected papers, and she kept the flame alive at a time when his stock was very low. So she gets tremendous credit for the contemporary reputation of Alexander Hamilton.
Good. These questions are excellent. I'm just going down. Your insight about the difference between seeking to destroy the other and finding a healthy conversation partner to debate is profound, the question asker states. Are there any tools from Jefferson or Hamilton that could help in our modern division to repair what seems to be more in the destructive impulse? Are there any tools that these gentlemen gave us?
They did generally attack each other's ideas more than their character. They were certainly not immune to some pretty rough blows. And of course, the James Callender, the gossip press of their time, both exposed Hamilton's affair and Jefferson's relation with his enslaved Sally Hemings. So it's not like it was a sanitized version of politics, but the debate between Hamilton and Jefferson was between questions like national power and states' rights and the scope of executive power and so forth. And it's the personalization of politics that has made things so difficult to recover, aided by social media technology. And then people become more loyal to a party leader than to debating the other party's ideas. The party comes to stand for personality rather than for principles. We've got to get back to debating principles rather than personality.
Mm. And I wonder what tools will help us do that. I mean, the whole purpose of Village Square really is to do that, is to have a safe place where people with different views can gather and civilly converse. Listen to people like you, and that will prompt conversations. And that's for 20 years it's been doing that. That I'm assuming that you would probably say that's the kind of thing we need to do more of, and all of the streaming partners that we have here.
Absolutely. It's crucial. Create these platforms.
Liz has told me, because it's 8:20, I need to say this, that before we close tonight, I wanted to ask you to click now on the link we're putting in the chat window and complete our post-evaluation survey. in the last few minutes of this program. We can't use the data unless you do both a pre and post evaluation. There you go. Do you foresee that we will call a new constitutional convention this century?
No, it's very hard to do, and there's not a consensus around any amendment that would create a two-thirds majority. The Constitution Center had a great project where we asked liberal, conservative, and progressive teams to draft constitutions from scratch. They came up with 5 amendments, term limits for Supreme Court justices, making amendment a little bit easier, and impeachment a little harder to and eliminating the natural born citizenship requirement for president, and resurrecting the legislative veto, which interestingly came up in the discussions about the tariffs case, where Justice Gorsuch said that without a legislative veto, Congress cedes power and it's like a one-way ratchet where it can't get it back. So those are all thoughtful proposals that have bipartisan consensus, but they're too geeky to ever inspire. Like even repeating them and describing them shows how difficult it would be to get 2/3 of both houses of Congress to propose and 3/4 of the states to ratify.
That's too bad. It'd be pretty exciting, wouldn't it?
Yeah, it would be.
Your your career is amazing, but I want to talk about this sort of trio of books: The Pursuit of Happiness, The Pursuit of Liberty, that I would encourage everyone to go out and read. But you now have another, right? That is in the offing, perhaps, The Pursuit of Union. Can you talk a little bit about what we're going to learn there?
Yes, it's the story of the 4 founders who shaped the Constitutional Convention and defined America. And one of them is familiar, Madison, of course, but the other 3 are the 3 who were the ones who spoke most frequently at the convention. And of that group, the most talkative delegate was Gouverneur Morris, and then James Wilson, and then Madison, and then Roger Sherman of Connecticut.
Interesting.
Telling their stories, which are so vivid, and what they believed union was for, and how they adjusted their views, and how their life stories came to define their vision of union, is going to be the subject of the next book.
And when do we get to see that?
That I will not promise, because I'm just starting it, but it'll be out sooner rather than later.
I love that. The only question you haven't answered tonight is on your own.
I'm not tell a lie like George Washington, so I don't want to.
Let's see if we have anything else here. I want to use up all of our time. You talked a little bit about your own habits of reading, and you talk about it in The Pursuit of Happiness, where you explain, getting up early and really a disciplined approach to trying to grapple with these really big questions from these, in some cases, ancient philosophers. Can you share any of the habits of either Jefferson or Hamilton, and in the sense of what did learning look like for them that might be inspirational for us?
Well, Jefferson's reading list inspired my whole project. It's so inspirational, not only for the scope of the books. They include not only moral philosophy, that was just one section, but novels and history and literature and science, but because of his schedule. And he recommends getting up before dawn, reading moral philosophy for 2 hours, watching the sunrise, then reading political philosophy and history until lunch, then scientific topics in the afternoon, then dinner, then Shakespeare and poetry for mild amusement, then bed. And I think it's 7 days a week, and this is for kids generally, but he kept up a version of that in for his whole life. And that's the inspiration. There are 2 things you can't do too much of: deep reading and deep listening to music. And reading is not just 15 minutes a day. You're really devoting hours and hours to it, or all of your spare time. And that's, I find that that's the struggle every day. Am I going to doom surf, whatever it's called, pointless scrolling of blogs or something like that, or even newspapers, under the guise of keeping myself informed, or just read a book and
Yeah.
discipline to stay with the book and read it through. I just before this show, I was doing too much scrolling of the war news, so I decided to read Plato's Republic, which I haven't read since college, and it's really good. And I'm glad I did.
And this is my last question. Jeff, in all of your reading and thinking, do you have a hero? Do you have a hero, maybe even a surprise hero, someone that you weren't expecting to come out of all of this study and thought?
I have many heroes, but I'll show you the one who's behind me by just turning the camera. And this is, any guesses? I don't know if you can see it.
I don't see it so very well, but
It's Louis Brandeis in
of course.
in the Andy Warhol print version. And I wrote a biography of Brandeis and was just so inspired. I actually, at the time, I called him the Jewish Jefferson, which he really was. He believed, like Jefferson, in the curse of bigness in business and government, and he thought that only on a small scale could people understand enough about the facts of running an organization to have fully participatory democracy. And he's also the greatest defender of free speech in the 20th century, with his great opinion in the Whitney case, which has a passage. Can I still do it? It's a good way to close. It's a good kind of party trick if I can still remember it. But he's quoting Jefferson and referring not to the Convention of 1787, but the Declaration of 1776. And Brandeis says, "Those who won our independence believed that the final end of the state was to make men free to develop their faculties, and that in its government the deliberative forces should prevail over the arbitrary. They valued liberty both as an end as a means. They believed liberty to be the secret of happiness, and courage to be the secret of liberty. They believe that freedom to think as you will and speak as you think are means indispensable to the discovery and spread of political truth. That without free speech and assembly, discussion would be futile, that with them, discussion affords ordinarily adequate protection against the dissemination of noxious doctrine, that the greatest threat to freedom is an inert people, that public discussion is a political duty, and that this should be a fundamental principle of the American government." Ooh, I got through it, but you can see why he's my hero.
Oh my. Well, there is one cannot close any better. Thank you so much, Jeffrey Rosen. This was just magnificent. Thank you for your thought and your decency and your scholarship. It's just fantastic. So, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of Florida Humanities and the Village Square and our streaming partners, we want to thank you for joining us tonight. Thank you, Jeffrey Rosen. Good night, everyone.
Thank you, Steve, for a wonderful conversation.
Beautiful.